Greetings. Right now we are after the fast in the month of December in 29 AD, but we are before the wedding in Cana. So, subtext, Monday, December 12th, 29 AD, we are Kislev the 18th. That's the Hebrew month. Jesus healed here for the first time since his return from the desert. On account of the cures wrought among them, the people were urgent in their prayers for him to remain, but he departed. Subtext, Tuesday, December 13th. With Andrew, Saturnin, Joseph of Arimathea's nephews, Aram and Themeni, and others, about 12 in all, he went in an oblique line toward the north until he reached the public ferry leading to the high road of Dibon, over which he had crossed in going from Gilgal to Dibon at the Feast of Tabernacles. It takes tolerably long to cross the river at this point because the steep bank directly opposite does not afford a landing place. From here, Jesus and his little company journeyed on for about an hour over the base of a mountain in the direction of Samaria until they arrived at a small place consisting of only one row of houses and which had no school. It was occupied entirely by shepherds and kind-hearted people who were clothed in almost the same style as the shepherds I saw at the crib. Jesus taught in the open air on a little elevation whereon a teacher's chair of stone was erected. The people here had received John's baptism. Okay, so subtext, Jesus in Shiloh, Kibzaim, and Thebez. Wednesday, December 14th. I next saw Jesus in Shiloh, a city built around a high steep rock with an extended plateau on a gently rising mountain range. On this plateau, the highest elevation of the mountain range in early times after the departure from Egypt, and during the journey through the desert, the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant had rested. There was a large place surrounded by a wall, partly in ruins, and in it might still be seen the remains of the little building that had been erected over the tabernacle. On the spot whereon the ark had stood, under a roof which rested upon open arches, was a pillar similar to the one in Gilgal, and under it a kind of vault excavated in the rocky foundation. Not far from the spot occupied by the ark was a place for offering sacrifice and a covered pit for the reception of the refuse of the slaughter. For they were permitted to offer sacrifice here 3 or 4 times in the year. The synagogue was also built on this enclosed space of the plateau, from which was presented a widely extended view. From it one could see the plateau of Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, and far over many mountains. Shiloh itself was a somewhat dilapidated and not very populous city. It possessed 2 schools, one belonging to the Pharisees, the other to the Sadducees. But the people were not good. They were arrogant, full of self-conceit and false assurance. At some distance from the city gate, with its dilapidated towers, stood an Essene cloister now fallen to ruin, and nearer to the city was a house wherein the Benjaminites had confined the virgins whom, at the Feast of Tabernacles, they had brought captive to Shiloh. Jesus, with his 12 companions, put up at a house at which traveling teachers and prophets were privileged. It was adjoining the schools and dwellings of the Pharisees and scribes, who had a kind of seminary here. About 20 of these scribes, in their long robes and girdles with long, rough tufts hanging from their sleeves, gathered around Jesus. They feigned not to know him, and spoke of Jesus as of a third person, using all kinds of cutting speeches, such as, "Now, how will it be? There are 2 baptisms, that of John and that of Jesus, the carpenter's son of Galilee. which now will be the right baptism. They went on to say that they had heard also that women attached themselves to the mother of this carpenter's son. For instance, a widow with her 2 sons. These latter, at the instigation of their mother, joined the followers of Jesus, while she herself went with his mother. And so they traveled about, but as for themselves, they needed not such novelties. They had the promise and the law. All this they did not express bluntly and rudely, but with a semblance of mock friendship with Jesus. He answered their pointed speeches by saying that he was the one of whom they were speaking. And when they referred to the voice heard at his baptism, he informed them that it was the voice of his heavenly Father, who was the Father of everyone who would repent of his sins and be regenerated by baptism. Then, affecting to consider it a very sacred place, they expressed unwillingness to allow Jesus and his disciples to enter the enclosure where formerly the Ark of the Covenant had stood. But Jesus, heedless of their opposition, entered. He reproached them with having, on account of their wickedness, lost the Ark of the Covenant, that now, preserving only the remembrance of it, they were still just as bad, that they had always violated the law in the past as well as in the present, and that, as the ark had been withdrawn from the keeping of their ancestors, so now would the fulfillment of the law be taken from themselves. As those men showed a desire to dispute with him on some points of the law, he stood them out, 2 by 2, and interrogated them like children, proposing to them many deep questions in the law. They were unable to answer, so, confused and angry, muttering and nudging one another with the elbow, they began to slink away. Then Jesus had led them to the covered pit, which had been thrown the refuse of the sacrifice. He ordered them to uncover it and told them in a similitude that they were like unto that pit, inwardly full of order and rottenness and unfit for sacrifice, though outwardly clean, their unsightliness covered over by a fine exterior. He reminded them that from this very spot, as punishment of the sins of their forefathers, the holy ark had been taken away. They all left the place in anger. Subtext, Thursday, December 15th. When Jesus taught in the synagogue, he insisted especially upon the reverence due to the aged and love towards parents. He spoke warmly on these points, for the people of Shiloh had long been in the wicked habit of slighting, despising, and disowning their aged parents. A road led to Shiloh from Bethel on the south. Lebona was not far distant, and to Samaria from Bethel it may have been from 8 to 9 hours. The prophet Jonah lies buried at Shiloh. Subtext, Friday, December 16. When Jesus left Shiloh from the opposite side of the city, the northwest, Andrew, Saturnin, and Joseph of Arimathea's nephews separated from him and proceeded on ahead to Galilee. Jesus, with some disciples of John, then in his company directed his steps to Kibzaim, where he arrived before the Sabbath. Kibzaim lay in a valley between 2 branches of a mountain range that extended through the middle of the country and assumed in this place almost the exact shape of a wolf's claw. The people were good, hospitable souls and well inclined to Jesus, whose coming they were expecting. Kibzaim was a Levitical city. Jesus put up near the school with one of the head men. There arrived also to salute Jesus Lazarus, Martha, Johanna Chusa, the son of Simeon, who was employed at the temple, and the old servant of the first named. They were on the way to the wedding at Cana, and had been informed by messengers that they would here meet Jesus. Jesus, from the very first, always treated Lazarus with distinction and as a very dear friend. And yet I never heard him ask, How is such and such a one of thy relatives or acquaintances? Subtext, Saturday, December 17th. Kivzaim was a solitary place hidden away in a corner of a mountain. The inhabitants subsisted chiefly by the cultivation of fruits. The manufacture of tents and carpets was also carried on, and many were engaged in sandal making. Jesus spent the Sabbath here and cured several sick persons by a word of command. Some were dropsical and others simpletons. They were brought on litters to Jesus and set down in front of the school. Jesus took a repast at the house of a distinguished Levite. After the Sabbath, he went again to Shechem, where he arrived late and passed the night at an inn appointed for him. Lazarus and his party went from Kibzaim straight to Galilee. Subtext, Sunday, December 18. Early next morning, Jesus went from Shechem northeastwardly towards Thebez, or Thebez, I guess. I butcher a lot of these names. I'm sorry about that. Anyways, in Shechem, he could not teach. There were no Jews. The inhabitants were made up of Samaritans and some others who had settled there, either after the Babylonian captivity or in consequence of a war. They used to go up to the temple of Jerusalem, though they did not join in the Jewish sacrifices. Near Shechem, in that beautiful field which Jacob bought for his son Joseph, a part of it already belonged to Herod of Galilee. A boundary consisting of stakes, a rampart of earth, and a path ran through the valley. Thebez was quite an important city, traversed by a highway and possessed of considerable trade. Heavily laden camels, their burdens rising high upon their backs, came and went. It was something wonderful to see those animals with their packs like so many little towers, climbing slowly over the mountain, their head at the end of the long neck, moving from side to side before the lofty burden. Raw silk formed a chief staple of trade. The people of Thebes were not bad, nor were they prejudiced against Jesus, but they were neither simple nor childlike. They were indifferent, as well-to-do tradespeople often are. The priests and scribes were content with themselves and indifferent to others. As Jesus entered the city, the possessed and the lunatics raised their cry, "There comes the prophet of Galilee! He has power over us! He will drive us away!" Jesus commanded them silence, and instantly they became quiet. Jesus put up near the synagogue, whither the crowds followed him, bringing with them their sick, of whom he healed many. That evening he taught in the school and celebrated the feast of dedication, which then began. In the school and in the houses 7 lights were lit. Also outdoor in the fields and on the roads near the shepherds' huts were little burning tufts of something on the end of stakes. Thebes was admirably situated on the mountain. At some distance one could see the mountain road running through it and the laden camels climbing up, but near the city the view was hidden. Andrew, Saturnin, and Joseph's nephews had already left Shiloh and gone to Galilee. Andrew had been up among his relatives at Bethsaida. He had informed Peter that he had again found the Messiah, who was on his way up to Galilee, and that he would take him, that is Peter, to him. All went now to Arbela, called also Betharbel, to see Nathanael chaste, who was there on business, and to induce him to go with them to celebrate the feast at Genabris. Chaste. Okay, so just as an aside, the name reads chaste, but I'm guessing it's like something like chazed or something. So I'll just say chazed so that we can distinguish the terms. So I'll continue. Chazed resided at that time in Genabris in a high house that, with several others, stood by itself outside the city. The disciples spoke much to him of Jesus. Andrew had purposely taken them there for the feast because he, as well as they, counted upon Nathanael. They were eager to hear his opinion, but Nathanael appeared rather indifferent to the whole affair. Lazarus had brought Martha and Johanna Chusa to Mary, then at Capernaum, whither she had come from Cana. They set off again for Tiberias, where they hoped to meet Jesus. Simeon's son was one of the escorts, and the bridegroom of Cana went also to meet the Lord. This bridegroom was the son of the daughter of Sobe, the sister of Anne. His name was Nathanael as well. He did not belong to Cana, though he was married there. Genabris was a populated city. A highway ran through it, and there was much business and traffic carried on, especially in silk. It was in the country, a couple of hours from Tiberias, from which it was separated by mountains. To reach it, one had to go somewhat southward between Emmaus and Tiberias, and then turn to the latter. Arbela was between Sepphoris and Tiberias. Subtext: first formal call of Peter, Philip, and Nathanael. Subtext: Monday, December 19th, 29 AD, the month of Kislev, the 25th. Jesus departed before daybreak from Thebez. He and his disciples proceeded at first eastward, and then turning to the north, journeyed along the base of the mountain and through the valley of the Jordan toward Tiberias. He passed through Abel Meholah, a beautiful city, where the mountain extends more to the north. It was the birthplace of Elisha, the prophet. The city is built on a spur of the mountain, and I noticed the great difference between the fruitfulness of its sunny side and its northern one. The inhabitants were tolerably good. They had heard of the miracles wrought by Jesus at Kibzaim and Thebez, so they stayed with him on the way, begging him to tarry with them and heal their sick. The excitement became almost tumultuous, but Jesus did not stay with them long. The city was about 4 hours from Thebez. Jesus passed near Scythopolis and on to the Jordan. As he journeyed from Abel Meholah, he met near a little city about 6 hours from Tiberias, Andrew, Peter, and John. Leaving the other friends in Genabris, these three had come on to meet Jesus. Peter and John were in this part of the country upon some business connected with their fishery. They intended to proceed direct to Genabris, but Andrew persuaded them to go first to meet the Lord. Andrew presented his brother to Jesus, who, among other words, said to him, "Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas." This was said at the first salutation. To John, Jesus addressed some words relative to their next meeting. Then Peter and John went to Genabris, while Andrew accompanied Jesus into the environs of Tarichea. John the Baptist had, by this time, abandoned his place of baptism on this side of the Jordan, near Ono. He had crossed the river and was now baptizing about 1 hour to the north of Bethabara, at the place whereon Jesus had lately allowed the disciples to baptize and where John himself had baptized at an earlier period. John had made this change to suit their convenience of the people from the region under Philip the Tetrarch. Philip was a good-natured man. Many of his people desired baptism, but were unwilling to cross the Jordan to receive it. Among them were many of the pagans. The last visit that Jesus made to this part of the country had roused in numbers the desire after baptism. Another reason also influenced John to baptize where Jesus' disciples had lately been similarly engaged, and that was to show that there was no disunion between him and Jesus. Now, despite it just being under 20 minutes, I will cut it off here, so that will conclude the reading. All right, so my notes. I don't have any major discourse in this one because a lot of this stuff was just narratives, and we've been familiar with a lot of what Jesus has been doing. This is why it's kind of like a lot of it is repetitive. So the first note, the Benjaminites putting up the virgins at a house. This was a reference to, I believe, the last chapter of Judges, the book of Judges, where the Benjaminites had gone to war with the rest of Israel because of the events that took place at Gibeah, which were very much like Sodom. And so after resolution, Israel refused to give Benjamin their daughters. Like the rest of Israel, they weren't giving them their daughters. So the Benjaminites had to go to a foreign land and pillage their virgins. And this was a strange narrative. Like they found them dancing and then they just took them away kind of thing. I don't know how that happened, but anyways, it was for their young men to wed so that they could continue subsisting as a clan. Two important Benjaminites were historically Saul, the first king, although that didn't end really well, and of course, St. Paul the Apostle. Next note, the Pharisees had the promise and the law, just like the Protestants have the Bible. They don't need anything more, right? Sometimes I give other religions a very crude term. The religions being the art of saying F off to Catholicism. Now, I guess the Pharisees used the promise and the law as the art of saying F off to Jesus Christ. Not smart, but that's the way it is. People, in their blind loyalty to their faith, are often creating a prejudice against the true faith, and then people of the true faith not only have to convince them as if they were children, but they have to battle through those prejudices. And sometimes it's just nigh impossible to do that. And think of it this way. Jesus couldn't battle through the prejudice. He went and offered himself up as a sacrifice because he knew they would kill him. Because he says, he laments to them, how I long to gather you like a hen gathered the chicks under her wing, and they wouldn't do it. I mean, that's what prejudice does. It's the art of saying F off to the truth. And every false religion is a prejudice. That's the way the demons designed them. Okay, so next note. They mention a Levitical city. The tribe of Levi was not given land like the other tribes were. There were 13 tribes, but it's like, well, it's the 12 tribes, yeah. But Joseph had 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, which largely comprised of Samaria at this time. And Levi was not given tribes; they were given cities because they were getting their tithes, so they could support their cities for commercial reasons, actually, and that's probably what they did. Anyways. They were the keepers of the ark and had other sacred duties in the temples and synagogues, so they did a lot of that. They were, if you want to read about Levitical cities in the Old Testament, go to Numbers 35. They're mentioned there. I think there's like 48 of them or something like that. Next note, the Feast of Dedication was mentioned, and this is one of the 2 feasts that were originated by the Jews. The other 5 being originated by God to Moses. One of the ones originated by the Jews was a commemoration of what Esther had done for them when she had married the king of Persia. And this one they were celebrating, dedication, being modern day Hanukkah, is the one they celebrate in December, or Kislev. And this one commemorated the Maccabean revolt and an event. I can't remember the details of this really that well, but an event that occurred in a temple. They only had sufficient enough oil to keep the lamp lit for one day, and it burned miraculously for 7 more, I believe. So dedication took place again in Kislev, which is typically concurrent with December, which is why they around Christmas, they're celebrating Hanukkah. Their calendar runs on moon cycles, for anyone that doesn't know. Last note, he gives Peter the line, thou art Simon Bar-Jonah, but thou shalt be called Peter. So some people might have wondered, well, he met Peter this way. Why didn't he meet the other apostles this way, kind of thing? And if you watch like shows like The Chosen, they always kind of like magicalize the moments, right? So in real life, yes, he gave Peter this line, but that's because he wasn't really acquainted with Peter at this time. However, remember, Jesus was acquainted, although maybe not very well, and even somewhat related because of the Essenian origin, to a lot of the other apostles, including Simon the Zealot, Judas Thaddeus, John and James. He had acquaintance with them. I think they're related to him distantly on his mother's side. Anyways, it doesn't seem like the disciples were formally called yet, so we're still kind of waiting for that. That's it. Ave Maria.